My name is Jacob. I am a master's student at BGSU studying physics. I am currently involved in some nanoparticle research there, as well as astrophysics, which is my first love. And as of last week, I have committed to the University of Toledo to do my PhD there starting next fall. So that is a fulfillment of a lifelong dream and the continuation of my scientific career, which has always served as the biggest inspiration for my faith. A little background on myself. I was raised in church. My family was always very involved, and I've always had a natural curiosity about science, and I only had two plans for my life. Either get a PhD in astrophysics or play in the NFL, and one of those two things isn't going to happen. So we're trying our best to get the other one to happen right now. Welcome to our discussion. As Steve introed, we are talking about faith and science tonight, and you're going to hear all about why and why this is important and all those things. So a few disclaimers before we get started. One, thank you for coming. Two, we should have more people coming. At least people said they would be here. So if people trickle in, that's to be expected. We have some cookies and coffee in the back. Feel free to get up and get them as you feel fit. We will have a cookie and coffee break about halfway through, but I won't be distracted if you get up, so feel free. The structure of the night is I'm going to speak for a little bit here at the beginning, kind of lay some of the groundwork for the night, answer some big topic questions that I'm sure would come up in our discussion to begin with. We then have this QR code on the flyers we put out where you can ask questions prior to tonight that you want to make sure got asked. So I've gone through and prepared answers to those questions, which I will answer first coming out of our break, and then we will open it up to live Q&A as well with whatever remaining time we have. We have the schedule from 7 to 9. I am happy to stay here until next week talking with you if you want, so do not feel pressured to stay late or to leave early if you need to get going. I know for the students in the room that next week is exam week, and you're probably mad I reminded you of that, but I understand. So by all means, do what you need to do. All right. We also now remote for the slides tonight. So if you hear me say slide, I'm talking to my mother in the back who is running slides. So, slide. All right, so we're going to start tonight with Bible verse, which seems appropriate. So we're going to start with Romans 1:20, which is one of my favorite verses. For since the creation of the world, the invisible existence of God and his everlasting power have been clearly seen by the mind's understanding of created things, so that people are without excuse. You hear this verse quoted a lot, and it's typically used as an example for why people who have not yet been reached by the gospel still are having a chance to believe in God, because the evidence for God is before them. They have it as clearly seen by the mind's understanding of created things, which sounds like a pretty good description of science to me, the mind's understanding of created things. And ultimately, this is what I and many others are passionate about. So, unfortunately, in the last several, I'd say 100, 150 years, this conversation of faith and science, which in my view are really two sides of the same coin. They are two methods of seeking answers about the universe and about life and about the human condition and all those things. And unfortunately, in the last century or so, this conversation has turned around from a faith and science conversation to a faith versus science conversation. And this is also a conversation that does not happen very often. I'm going to pick on Steve for a second. We were planning tonight. I asked, we were talking about this, and Steve's always been very supportive of this idea, so thank you, Steve. When we were talking about this, I asked Steve, I said, when was the last time you said the word creationism from stage, or cosmology, or evolution, or any of those words that are associated with this topic? And he said, I don't think I've ever said any of those words from stage. And that's the point, is that we have largely, by we, I mean the Big C Church, Christianity as a whole, avoided this conversation because it's not an easy conversation to have. And so we've largely avoided it, by my estimation, for a while. And this conversation certainly isn't being held in academia and within science circles either. And there are reasons for that, and we'll get more into that as the night goes on. But to start, I want to give a historical perspective for you and kind of show how this current climate of this discussion has kind of been brought about. So if we go to the next slide, we'll start by looking at two scientists you probably recognize the names of, Copernicus and Galileo, both of whom were Christians, both of whom were essentially persecuted by the church in the 15th and 16th centuries for their scientific discoveries. Copernicus rediscovered the heliocentric theory, the sun and planets orbit, or sorry, the Earth and the planets orbit the sun, rather than the other way around. I say rediscovered because the Greeks knew this some 2,000 years earlier, but that knowledge had not spread to Europe in the Middle Ages, and so Copernicus was the one who rediscovered it. Galileo came a little bit after Copernicus. Their lives overlapped a little bit. But Galileo came later, and he endorsed Copernicus's view of the heliocentric theory, which of course is correct. And Galileo was an Italian man who lived under the authority, legal authority at the time of the Catholic Church, who promptly put him under house arrest for the rest of his life after he refused to stop pushing the issue. And both men died as still holding on to their faith. Galileo also has this awesome quote on the next slide, which is not only applicable to tonight, but also I find widely applicable in life. I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use. Feel free to send that to the family member of choice that you think needs to hear that. Next slide. Go a little later into history, and we hit Sir Isaac Newton. Newton was a devout Christian whose views on Christianity are fascinating. At the time, he was not very public about his Christianity because he did not believe necessarily the traditional view of the Trinity that most of us here at Brookside would have, or that Christian at the time had. But he was a devout Christian, and he's also, for my money, the second greatest scientist who ever lived, and laid the groundwork for pretty much all of modern physics. And some people would consider him to be the first physicist, truly, in the way we think about them today. And, he has several quotes that I like. System and gravity may put the planets into motion, but without divine power, it could not have put them into such a circulating motion as they have about the sun. He said, this most beautiful system, the universe, could only proceed from the dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. And at the time, this was not a popular view. Newton's most famous discovery, of course, is gravity, and a British minister at the time was once quoted in Parliament saying gravity is subversive of religion. So this was not exactly something that was a popular view, but Newton largely avoided persecution, unlike Copernicus, throughout his life. He remained steadfast in his faith, and actually was a bit of an amateur theologian as well. Wrote extensively about the early church and the early church leaders. Next slide. Go to Lord Kelvin. Yes, that Kelvin, the one that you're thinking of right now. For the temperature scale, physicist, chemist, brilliant man, lived in the 1800s. He said, I believe that the more strongly science is studied, the further does it take us from anything comparable to atheism. He said, do not be afraid to be free thinkers. If you think strongly enough, you'll be forced by science to a belief in God. I don't really have much more to add to that one. I just thought that those two quotes were widely applicable to the right and reflect my own views well. Next slide. I have not put the names of the people who said these things on the slide. I will reveal them to you in a minute. These are quotes, the top two from one scientist, the bottom one from a second scientist. Both have lived in the last century, century and a half, and both have kind of interesting views and present different views that we will be talking about tonight on the subject. So the top quote, the top two are from the man's autobiography. So the first quote is early on. He says, the impossibility of conceiving that this grand and wondrous universe with our conscious selves arose through chance seems to me the chief argument for the existence of God. Which seems like a pretty good endorsement about science revealing God and his nature. But then he continues in his autobiography by saying, the mystery, the beginning of all things, is insoluble to us, and I, for one, must be content to remain an agnostic. And this man did indeed end up dying an agnostic, wrote extensively about his faith and his journey, and really a fascinating story. Second scientist says, everyone who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that a spirit is manifest in the walls of the universe, a spirit vastly superior to that of man, and one in the face of which we, with our modest powers, must feel humble. Sorry, I have a bit of a cough today. I'll do my best to control it. Again, this is a quote that is not endorsing the idea of God as we typically think of it in Christian circles or in other world religions, but rather the idea of a higher power, the idea that there is something that science reveals that is not natural, that there is something beyond what we can simply observe and study scientifically. Both these men are very famous. Do you have any guesses as to who these two men may be? Not at all. Okay. Next slide will reveal them to you. The first two, slide.
Sorry.
The first two belong to Charles Darwin, the father of evolution, who started his life as a Christian, lost his faith when he was about 40 years old, about the same time that he had completed his voyage that led to him writing The Origin of Species. He also suffered many personal tragedies, several deaths of family members, including his young daughter, which was kind of the nail in the coffin for his faith. However, he also was viewed as kind of an atheist hero at the time because it was one of the first big breaks away from the church. And this was a role that he vehemently refused to take. He refused to be the leader of the agnostic atheist revolution at the time because he was uncomfortable in that role. He also hesitated to publish The Origin of Species for nearly 20 years. Now, there have been debates historically about why he hesitated, but many people have claimed that it was because of his own internal conflict with what he was about to publish and trying to reconcile that with his own faith. Einstein was a fascinating man, for my money and most people's money, the smartest man who's ever been. He was not a Christian by any means. First off, he was ethnically Jewish. That's why he fled to America in the 30s to Germany, for obvious reasons. And Einstein wrote extensively about his faith because people like to ask Einstein about it. And Einstein made it clear that he did not believe in the Christian God or the Jewish God or Muslim God or any God. But he did, through the quote up there, say repeatedly that he believed in a supernatural higher order of the universe. That there was something about the universe that made him believe that there's something other than natural to it, which is a view that I think has become a pretty regular part of modern science life. And I'll show you some things about that here in a bit. Next slide. So what's the point of the conversation tonight? Well, I kind of laid it out already. I'd like to turn the conversation of faith versus science into faith and science. In the last 150 years, the two have really become more at odds with each other than before. And a large part of that is due to Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species and the emergence of evolution as the leading scientific theory of how we got here on the planet. However, I found these polls, and I find them interesting, but not necessarily the reasons you're thinking. So this poll on the left, these are both by Pew Research taken in the last 10 years. This one polled U.S. adults and found that people asked them how often they thought science and religion were in conflict. And so as you would expect, people who seldomly attended church said they were more often in conflict than people who did attend church regularly. But that's not the point I'm making with this. The point I'm making is that a full 50% of people who attended church regularly say that faith and science are consistently at odds with one another. To me, that reveals the failure of all of us to endorse this conversation and have it more regularly within church spaces. The one on the right is a same thing, poll from Pew Research Center. This is the religious belief among the general public as opposed to people, as opposed to scientists, which they define in their poll as people within with STEM career. So this poll, as you would see, 83% claim they believe in God. God in this poll was defined as essentially the American idea of God. They really define it very tightly, and so you would assume that most people answering yes to this question, all being Americans, are coming from the Christian or Jewish perspective. 12% of Americans said they don't believe in God, but they do believe in the universal spirit or a higher power. 4% said they didn't believe in God, 1% refused to answer. Again, not what I'm pointing out. What I am pointing out is the disparity between this number and this number. That scientists are 6% more likely to say they believe in a higher power without defining that higher power as God. And as I mentioned on the last slide, I think this is indicative of a lot of people's views. I know from the conversations I've had with my professors at both the universities that I've been at, as well as my peers,